on Sky News Australia. This is the Rita Panahi Show.
Good evening and welcome to the Rita Panahi Show. Coming up tonight, details on the extraordinary deals Queensland's Labor government has struck with its union mates. You will not believe the largesse you're funding, including double pay when it rains. Professor Plimer will take us through Chris Bowen's latest own goal, and Josh Hammer will join me from the US with disturbing allegations about Joe Biden made by his own daughter. And Joel Burney will be here to respond to Penny Wong's calls for a Palestinian state. And as always, plenty of lefties losing it, including this lot at a pro-refugee rally.
Would you adopt a refugee into your home?
No, thank you.
No? Adopt a refugee?
I would be willing, yeah, if I had the space.
If you had the space?
Yeah.
So where should we put them then?
Where should we put them?
Yeah.
Joining me now is Sky News contributor Gary Hardgrave. Gary, we have plenty to cover. Let's start with your home state.
Hey, Rita.
Queensland's Labor government has made some extraordinarily cushy deals with the unions here. The Courier Mail reports union workers can put down their tools when it reaches 35 degrees or 29 degrees with 75% humidity. Lucky it's never hot or humid in Queensland. It gets better. They get paid double time when required to work in the rain. They'll get a scaled site allowance of up to $11 per hour working on projects that are worth more than $1 billion. Why? They get a mobile phone allowance. They get paid an additional hour's pay if they're up on an 8-metre ladder. And they get paid more if they are required to work in Mount Isa. They'll also enjoy an annual picnic day or double time and a half if they have to work that day. Gary, some of these perks, especially those that are weather dependent, seem to be taking the taxpayers for an absolute ride here. I mean, downing tools when it's 29 degrees and 75% humidity. It's Queensland.
We're back to the same sort of stupidity that was around in the old BLF days back in the 80s when they had dim sim allowance as they were building Darling Harbour because they could smell all of the fumes coming up from the Sussex Street Chinese restaurants. A dim sim allowance. Look, this is the serious part about this, a month of rostered days off. So, of course, they pick and choose and add on days. So you'll see big building sites with no activity for a week or more while people have time off. All sounds terrific. Apparently the best practice guide for construction. It's costing between $6 and $9 billion extra on building projects, government-funded building projects in Queensland. But for everyday Queenslanders, if you want to get some work done at home, you've got to be prepared to pay what the taxpayer, what the government is willing to fund under this scheme. So the cost of concrete, the cost of tradies, the cost of windows, the cost of steel, you name it, it's going up. And nothing's getting built fast. And apparently we're having an Olympics here in 2032. You may have read about that. I don't think we're going to get it built. I really don't. I really think we're not going to get these Olympics built under this. But no one wants to take them on. And the only way to do it is to abolish this, rip it up, tear it up and start building up things that Queensland needs. So we're heading for between 4 and 6 million people over the next decade or so in southeast Queensland. We're already at the 4 million, so we're heading to 6. I don't know how we're going to build the infrastructure, Rita, under these sorts of stupid schemes. Simple as that.
Well, you're going to have a lot of debt because the cost blowouts, I think, are going to be enormous with these sort of deals being struck. Now, let's go to Victoria. Premier Jacinta Allen is considering a land tax and stamp duty exemption for those who identify as Indigenous as part of coming treaty negotiations. The lunacy in Victoria never stops, but let's not forget Victorians voted against the voice, Gary. The last thing they want to see is a treaty, but here we are. And also must be noted, land tax rates here have soared. Victoria has got the biggest debt of any state by some margin. And you can soon have some very wealthy individuals who claim Indigenous heritage not paying property taxes. That seems crazy.
Oh, I've done my ancestry DNA and I can't find a stripe of it, so I'm really devastated about it. But look, Victoria is the place to flee for a lot of reasons. It's pretty simple, but this is the sort of divisive thing the left always does, Rita. They want to divide us up into little groups, little tribes, and have us suspecting the other and being narky towards the other, and yet we should be finding the stuff we've got in common. That's how you actually build a community, is out of the common ground that brings us together. So treating people differently because of race, this kind of property apartheid, is not a recipe for keeping a community together. It's going to create a lot of angst, a lot of anger. So if you voted no to the Voice in Victoria, it's probably time to vote no to this dreadful left-wing Labor government you have in Victoria as well. But then the Liberals have got to get their act together. So as the Arabs would say, inshallah, God willing, that will happen.
Well, yeah, let's just see what the Liberals do, because at the last state election, they were all for the treaty. They were all for it. And it took them some time after the Voice referendum to walk away from it. That's how weak they are. Now, the war on property owners continues. We've got the project giving a platform to some dude who wants squatters to reclaim vacant houses. We've got state governments increasing taxes. And then there's the interest rate hike. So it's little wonder that so many property investors, mum and dad investors, are fleeing the market, opting to put their money elsewhere. That trend is particularly evident in Victoria. 1 in 4 landlords sold a property last year. And what's happened in Victoria is going to happen in other capital cities too. The Daily Telegraph reports today that landlords are selling off, and that's going to hit renters hard. Not only will renters continue to experience heightened competition, but rental costs will increase further. Gary, it's almost like demonising property investors has backfired.
And the pathway to personal wealth is property ownership, as you know, only like 4% of the world actually own their own home. So Australia was way up there. If, you know, the richest 4% in the world actually own their own home. So Australia has a much better figure than that, but they're trying to kill us off. They're trying to kill off suburbia. They want everything to be grey and bleak and institutionalised, a bit like it was in the sort of Soros youth and the mindset of the kind of Soviet bloc building idea, and people feel very disoriented. Young people don't feel encouraged. They feel like they're never going to be able to own a home. They will own a home as soon as government stops trying to take money off people before they can get that home. And be it compulsory superannuation, be it high stamp duty, be it all of these other onerous requirements, any wonder people are bailing out. And I know people in Melbourne have done exactly that. They've said, I'm going to sell it, I want to get out, because right now, if they want to rip out a wall and bring an elephant into the lounge room, they can do it, and I'm just the owner of the house, I can't stop them. So it's pretty well discouraging, that kind of private investment, and people are voting with their feet and walking.
Well, yes, they had a whole raft of new requirements that transferred pretty much all the power into the hands of tenants. And you're right with the pet policy. That's just a small part of it. But yeah, you can't even say, no, I don't want a pet in my property. You've got to go to the tribunal and request for them to approve your decision on your property. I mean, it's crazy. Now, let's talk about this interesting case out of Tasmania. Their Museum of Old and New Art, Mona, is being ordered by the court to allow people who do not identify as ladies into their ladies' lounge exhibit. The exhibit is an art installation in which female patrons are pampered by male butlers, served champagne and offered exclusive access to some of the museum's most prized artworks. As a commentary, we are told, on the many male exclusive spaces that have barred women in the past. But Jason Lau didn't like this policy. He took legal action against the museum, claiming he was a victim of discrimination because he could not experience the artwork as women did. And Gary, he won. This is one for the men.
Oh, good luck to him. Look, you know, Look, the left would actually like to have a museum for old and new genders, and they'd call it Mong. It's real simple, wouldn't they? They just call it the Mong, not the Mona. Look, I understand the anger, and there's real anger about this kind of hiving people off on one of the 75 genders, and they've all got to be treated in different ways or same ways or whatever they want to do. People just want to have a whinge, don't they? But look, I don't mind the guy taking it on because it's kind of sending the whole thing up, isn't it, really? But I think women and girls should be allowed to be women and girls, and men and boys should be allowed to be men and boys, and they all should respect the other gender, or indeed possibly the other genders, depending on their take on all of this. But I know people who've looked at all of this and say they're non-binary, and so therefore they can go anywhere they like. Rita, you just can't make this nonsense up. You just can't make this nonsense up. Pretty simple.
I would bet any amount of money that if that dude, looking just as he does, said, I identify as a woman, they would have allowed him in, because judging by, I could be making assumptions, but judging by the politics of the artists here, I'm sure they're not one to actually be very protective of female-only spaces. As long as you identify as a woman, you could have come in. But he's fought it and he's won. Okay. Now, let's talk about the serious issue of health funds getting record numbers of complaints. The complaints are skyrocketed in the past year. Australian reports there's been a 27% jump in just 12 months. And nearly a third of those complaints were directed at Medibank. Gary, what's driving this jump?
Well, I think people are feeling awfully invested in private health insurance, and I think private health insurance should be nurtured because it's absolutely critical to the health task in Australia. So if you're starting to fund, thousands of dollars a year more than maybe you were a few years ago, you're of course going to feel as though all parts of the service need to be questioned, and you want to have that relationship working. And whether Medibank is really measuring up to people's expectations, it's up for the consumers to speak out. I really am sick of the rant in the media against private health insurance. We have a health system that relies on those who can afford it to do it. I still think we should bring it back to the idea of 30% subsidy for all participants into the private health system. I think people should be able to claim it as a tax deduction against their taxable income, no matter what their income happens to be, because we need as many healthy people, not just as many wealthy people in private health that is possible. But the health funds have got to realise it's a market out there, and I'm sure they do. The big ones, I think, are getting smarter about this, and the small ones are still as agile as they've always been. But I think it's great people are complaining, Rita, because they're taking ownership of the way the health funds work. Good on them.
Well, the cost has skyrocketed, and with the pressure on budgets, I can understand why people are pulling out of that, but that just puts an enormous extra strain on the public system.
Strain on the public.
Now, before you go,
Absolutely.
World Netball made the very sane, logical decision to ban transgender players from the international female level. They've done that to ensure fairness and safety. Their decision comes after a detailed view of the science and consultation with experts. Gary, we're critical of sporting bodies that ignore the science and pander to the activists. And I think here we should applaud those that make the right call. And it has to be said, it's a courageous call, because they're going to have the activists come for them, but their priority is obviously to protect women's sport.
Rita, the louder the activists yell, the more you know they've got the right decision in place. And look, as a father of a woman who herself is the mother of a couple of girls, I want those girls and those women to be able to participate with others who are the same kind of physical makeup and able to participate in sport on a fair and equal footing. The idea of some bloke declaring himself now a woman and he's able to compete on the sporting field as a woman is just a joke. And it's such a small group of people who want to do that, despite, of course, the potential for violation in change rooms and other environments in and around the sport. Look, by any measure, a lot of what's been going on here has been driven by activists who are trying to disorient our society, trying to destroy our society, and make us question our beliefs and the things that created the society that was strong until all of this rubbish kept going. And I think good on netball for staring it down. I just wished a few other sports would be also equally strong, because the players, the participants, their families and supporters need that certainty. And frankly, in a bigger, broader sense, our world needs that certainty. The idea that we're able to declare whatever we are and be it for the day just makes no sense. And we've just got to stare it down, Rita. Stare it down.
Absolutely. Gary Hardgrave, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you. Joining me now is esteemed geologist Professor Ian Plimer. Ian, let's start with the ABC's finance guru, Alan Kohler. He's insisting that the only way the Albanese government is going to get solar panels made in Australia is through tariffs, big ones. And we had just last week the Grattan Institute, the leftist Grattan Institute, similarly warning that the Australian solar manufacturing industry would never be able to compete with cheaper Chinese rivals, calling it a commercial bloodbath. The Albanese government is in deep trouble, Ian, when even the lefties are finding massive holes in their policies.
Well, they've got the policy wrong, and they don't know any way out of it. Now, they've created very, very expensive energy, and that expensive energy relies on having solar panels and wind turbines come from a very cheap Labor country, which has got cheap energy. So how do we become competitive? Well, we add a tariff. So what happens is we've already got an industry that is uneconomic. To try to make it economic, competitive, they add a tariff, which just adds more costs to you, the average electricity user. This is madness. Labor have never known how to balance the books, and they're demonstrating that beautifully.
Now, the Australian newspaper has revealed the extent of the Climate Change Department's frivolous spending. Naturally, much of the focus is on the billions wasted on renewable subsidies, but they're also wasting our money in other smaller ways, Ian, including $40,000 for sunglasses for extreme climate and almost $27,000 for a planning day for senior executive staff at a plush Canberra hotel. We also know they've gone big on transport. Let's not forget the lack of fallout and responsibility from that double private jet controversy. That seemed to die down very quickly, Ian, compared to, say, Bronwyn Bishop and the whole Choppergate saga. Where is the accountability here?
Well, there's none. Labor governments squawk and carry on about how when they're going to be in government, they will be transparent and they will have accountability. And as soon as they're in government, they close the doors. There's no transparency. There's no accountability. And here they have all of their fellow travellers going to a caviar and champagne day. And these people are so embarrassed by the absolute waste, they have to wear sunnies. So this has just gone from ridiculous to even worse. And this is very typical of those who have no idea. They're in there with their snouts in the trough. They're not paying the sort of electricity bills that people who are on an average or minimum wage are paying. These people out in voter land are hurting, and there's only one solution, is to demonstrate your agony with your vote.
Well, that is good advice, and but we need the opposition to have a coherent policy and give the voters a real choice, because I would argue at the last federal election we had two parties, both with net zero policies. So I don't know where the choice was there. Now, nobody seems to have told India about coal being terrible and finished. Prime Minister Modi has just celebrated India's historic milestone of crossing 1 billion tonnes in coal production as it commits to a plan for a vibrant coal sector. Ian, China also seems to have missed the coal is bad and dead message. Its coal imports are climbing as its coal mining projects expand. It's like they care more about human progress and cheap, reliable energy and well-paid jobs than they care about net zero fantasies. What's going on in India and China, Ian?
Well, these are pragmatic governments. These are countries that are trying to grow. These are countries that have for generations been very poor countries. Now, India not only is growing its coal industry and it's mining coal in Australia, taking it to ports which are coastal and having generators right next to these ports, but they're actually starting a huge nuclear industry. They've just commissioned a thorium reactor. They have a type of reactor that can now burn the spent fuel out of a conventional uranium reactor, and they can burn this, and India is going down the path of having a huge nuclear industry as well as having a huge coal industry, and China is no different. China is getting their coal deposits are getting deeper and deeper and deeper. That means they're importing more and more coal. They need this coal to grow. We are beneficiaries of that cheap energy. We are beneficiaries of the coal. And the coal that we sell China is being used to make solar panels, is being used to make wind turbines, and to put our coal mines out of productivity and put our coal-fired generations out of production. This is just madness. We should be looking at the cheapest energy that can be found. We are an energy-rich country, yet our two major sources of energy, uranium and coal, we are trying to ignore or wind down. This is madness.
It's self-inflicted madness, and we're going to have shortages shortly. They're talking about next winter having a gas shortage when we're on decades of reserve, Ian. We've got so much gas in this state, but there's no exploration.
Well, in Victoria, there is plenty of gas. I have seen the Wombat wells in the onshore Gippsland Basin. I've seen them flare. This means that there's gas there. Those wells, those 5 wells, are only a few kilometres from an existing pipeline. The gas coming out of those wells doesn't need to have mercury and carbon dioxide taking out of it. Victoria, in the eastern part of Victoria, has got a huge amount of gas. In the western part, underneath the Portland smelter, which is absolutely crippled with energy costs, there are gas deposits. There are gas deposits in the Otway Basin offshore. Victoria is digging its own grave. And to make matters worse, not only do you in Victoria have an appalling Labor government, you have an opposition that only seem to want to fight amongst themselves. They don't want to fight. What is happening in Victoria? And that is Victoria is going down the gurgler. The Victorian Liberals have a terrific opportunity to do something, and all they want to do is to fight over crumbs.
Ian Plimer, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much for your time tonight. And still to come, a Democrat congresswoman gives a bewildering lecture on space, while another accuses Israel of committing genocide. And as always, plenty of lefties losing it. Welcome back. Now it's time for Lefties Losing It. And let's start with MSNBC, the ever-reliable HQ for crazy conspiracy theories. Remember the whole Russian collusion hoax? And they also love to push unhinged hyperbole, like this next clip, courtesy of veteran Nicole Wallace, who makes a series of false claims about January 6 and then ends with this journalistic revelation.
Republicans have been on their back foot when it comes to January 6th, with an intentional refusal to accept the facts that led to the violent insurrection on the nation's capital. See this latest attempt by Louisiana Republican Clay Higgins, in which he accuses the FBI of entrapping rioters in the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. The fact is that January 6th was a deadly insurrection in which Trump supporters beat cops with flagpoles, full stop. That's it. You don't need to tell the whole story of January 6th. I don't know who this guy is. I've never heard of him. I've never seen him on social media. He's telling lunatic stories.
Actually, the facts are that it wasn't an insurrection, and the only person killed that day was an unarmed Trump supporter, Ashley Babbitt, who was shot dead by a police officer, Michael Bird. And let's just listen again to that final point Wallace made about January 6th, a topic MSNBC is obsessed with.
That's it. You don't need to tell the whole story of January 6th.
Yes, you just told Americans they don't need to know the whole story. That's the level of intellectual rigour among MSNBC news anchors these days. Now let's go to Michigan, where migrants who have opted to move to America are now chanting death to America.
Gaza has shown the entire world why these protests are so anti-America. Because it's the United States government that provides the funds for all of the atrocities that we just heard about. And this is why Imam Khomeini, who declared the International Day of Quds, this is why he would say to pour all of your chants and all of your shouts upon the head of America.
Yes, they are chanting death to America. Now, my family had to flee the mad Islamists of Iran. And if you stand with those Islamists, then what the hell are you doing in America? Kindly pack your bags and head back to Tehran or any other Islamist hellhole that shares your worldview. Now, let's go to the UK, where the young ones are taking their protests directly to the homes of politicians, including Labor leader Keir Starmer.
I'm Ella, I'm 21, and I'm here today. I've just put up this banner outside of Keir Starmer's house saying, "Starmer, stop the killing." Starmer's the leader of the Labour Party. He's got enormous power, enormous influence, and he can call on a two-way arms embargo on Israel to stop sending UK-made weapons over that are being used to cause genocide.
But given the efforts they've gone to intimidate a politician at his private residence where he lives with his children, these lefties losing it decided to double up their protests and also make a statement about catastrophic global warming that's going to kill us all.
He's at a position where he's got an enormous opportunity to make a real difference and to do something and to stop mass death that we know is coming from the climate crisis.
Staying in the UK, let's look at this classic series of vox pops at a pro-asylum seeker rally. But those protesting do not want to personally help any refugees. Seems a bit mean.
To actually adopt a refugee and take them into your home?
Well, if I had any space, I would.
If you had any space.
It wouldn't be a nice place to bring them because it's a bit overcrowded.
Right.
But yes, if I had the space, definitely.
Thank you very much for that, love. Pop one into your home?
I live in a rental place, so I can't.
Rental?
Yeah.
You can't do it?
Yeah.
Someone else's job?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
You can't take one?
I don't have a space.
Don't have the space? Can I have a refugee stay at your house?
Yeah, I don't mind.
You go on the list?
I don't mind, yeah, 100%, give me the thing. Oh wait, I can't, because my house is only a little small. And
amazing. Now, would you be willing to have a refugee in your home?
Yes, if I had room.
If you had room, it's funny that.
Look, I think if we ask more of these virtue signallers, one of them will step up and actually be willing to walk the talk, or just pretend to.
To adopt a refugee?
No, thank you.
No, thank you. Any reason in particular?
I don't. What sort of refugee are you talking about?
Would you be willing to adopt a refugee into your home?
No.
No.
Sorry, I can't.
Would you adopt a refugee into your home?
No, thank you.
No? Adopt a refugee?
I would be willing, yeah, if I had the space.
If you had the space?
Yeah.
So where should we put them then?
Where should we put them?
Yeah.
There's plenty of people who have stolen.
No one has any room. It's someone else's job. Thank God there isn't a housing crisis anywhere. Let's end with this brilliant bit of comedy courtesy of Ricky Gervais. This is Afterlife. I'm not sure if this is art imitating life or life imitating art.
Right. Once and for all, I identify as an 8-year-old girl called Denise. Therefore, I am an 8-year-old girl.
Well, tell that to your you silly
I identify as an 8-year-old girl.
No, you're not an 8-year-old girl.
You are what you identify as.
Paul's this sort of all the time. He saw a documentary once about ME, had that for a year.
That was a nightmare. You're tired all the time, I couldn't work.
It was bull.
There is a lot of misunderstanding and cynicism about the disease.
Yeah, and you didn't have it, you moron. Silly thought he caught last year.
I was 7.
Me. You're a 50-year-old plumber from Sheffield. Your name's Dennis, for sake.
It's Denise.
I'm not calling you Denise.
Again, transphobic, you see. If you love me, you deal with it.
I do love you. But I married Dennis Charlton, and if that's no longer your name, then I'm not married to you.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong is dangerously close to giving Hamas exactly what it wants, signalling that Australia could recognise a Palestinian state in the Middle East. The coalition are warning this is a win for the terrorists. Joining me now is Joel Burney, Executive Manager at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Joel, is recognising a Palestinian state the natural conclusion to what we've seen from the Albanese government in recent weeks? They've shown they do not fully stand with Israel.
Thanks for having me, Rita. Well, let's just say it's been a very tough week, a week and a half for the bilateral relationship between Australia and Israel. The rhetoric from the Australian government has certainly intensified after the very tragic and unfortunate death of Zomi Frankum. However, with the Foreign Minister's speech last night, in what she says in creating the framework for potential unilateral recognition, I think that has been rather consistent position of this government through successive ALP national conferences. This has been an adopted policy of the ALP for a number of years now. And even though there has been, I guess, a hesitation for the parliamentary caucus of the ALP to approve such unilateral recognition, which importantly the Jewish community and the Israeli pro-Israel community is against for many simple reasons.
One of those reasons surely is what would that look like? Who would be in charge of a Palestinian state? Because if there were elections today, it would probably be Hamas, if the latest polling is to be believed.
And that's critically important. So, you know, the government is trying to make a differentiation between Hamas and more moderate forces inside a Palestinian political society. I would make the very strong argument that the distinction between the two is very, very grey. Opinion polls recently in the West Bank, for instance, which is allegedly where the moderates rule, Hamas has significant support there. In actual fact, overwhelming support inside the West Bank. If elections were held, democratic elections were held in the West Bank, Hamas would probably win. So it's a question of, you know, you've got to be very careful with what you wish for.
Well, this is, we know, we mock the Palestinian Authority for not having elections, for, you know, having an election. How many years ago was that?
Oh, so now we're up to 19 years ago.
But one of the reasons they don't is because probably Hamas would win and win quite comfortably, and we would have another Gaza on our hands. Now, as Penny Wong said, it's not just Australia considering this option, but the international community. The US has been pushing for Israel to pursue peace for some time now, and now Senator Elizabeth Warren is out there insisting Israel is guilty of genocide. She made this claim at a mosque in Boston. What do you make of this? Because the Democrats have got all sorts of reasons why they are doing a U-turn on this issue. The Biden administration in the early days was a very strong ally after October 7, but we've seen them wavering, and the reasons for that are quite transparent. How do you see that crucial relationship between Israel and the US?
So I think there's a few factors to unpack there. Firstly, the timing is critically important in everything. So as you know the US very well, Rita. This is an election year. And so rhetoric of the fringes of both the right and the left are going to be amplified to push the main forces inside the Democrats and the Republicans to certain special interests. Inside the Democratic Party, there is an emboldened and very powerful progressive wing. Their positions on Israel-Palestine are very, very clear, and they are exerting as much pressure within that election year and within the context of that election year to pull the Biden administration away from its historic relationship with Israel. So I think that from a perspective of the alliance between the US and Israel, I think things are still currently intact. There is no daylight between the objectives of Israel and the United States administration in terms of defeating Hamas.
But like you said, you've got some very powerful forces within the Democrats. We're not talking about people on the fringes of the left. We're talking about veteran congresswomen, presidential candidate last time around. You've got the Squad, who have got enormous, disproportionate influence and power, if you ask me. And they do have a vulnerability in some of those swing states where there's large Muslim populations. So how do they handle that in election year? Because they do seem to be making a compromise in their support.
Well, for my suggestion, I would state that foreign policy very rarely has a huge impact in the general election in the United States. Economic issues, the cost of living and unemployment, things like this are really on the hearts and minds of Americans.
In some of those heavily Somalian areas, for example, where there was a recent election, those foreign issues are playing a big factor.
There's no doubt about that, but it comes down to leadership. If the United States decides to abandon Israel in its time of need right now, what type of message does that send to the Ukrainians, for instance? What type of message does it send to the American Arab allies in the region that are also facing the forces of the Iranian octopus, which is crucially causing a lot of mischief, not just in Israel, but throughout the whole region? So the consequences of America's departure from Israel is much broader than just the bilateral relationship between the United States and Israel. So I think that, and my hope is that the stronger and the more leadership-centric policies of the Biden administration will prevail over those very loud and dominant progressive elements of the Democratic Party.
Now, before you go, just quickly, the Albanese government has announced a special envoy for anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. They can't just do one, they've got to do both. Is this a positive move?
I'm unsure. Look, the Jewish community, for very clear reasons, it's very jarring to hear anti-Semitism and Islamophobia within the same sentence. We make the very clear position that the uptick in anti-Semitism has been the worst in Australia since the end of the Second World War, and we would expect that due to such a difficult time for Jewish people, that we would be able to at least have a discussion about our difficulties without bringing in other prejudices of other minorities, who some of those minorities happen to be perpetrators of anti-Semitism, as we know from the arrests.
Yes.
So I'd like to make the clear point that even though Islamophobia is a real thing, it is different from anti-Semitism in multiple ways, not just within the volume and within the quantity, but also in its nefarious, destabilising aspects and elements into the social cohesion of Australia. So whether or not it's a good thing or not, I would hope that the government does not use the appointment of such a person to again conflate anti-Semitism with Islamophobia, because that would be a problem. But I would like it to have some type of practical outcome that protects the not just Jewish citizens of Australia, but also make sure that we live in a cohesive, multicultural Australia.
Joel Burney, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Rita.
Still to come, Josh Hammer on why national public broadcasters who preach diversity are echo chambers that only attract very white, very wealthy audiences. And why is the media ignoring the disturbing claims made by President Joe Biden's daughter? That's after this. Welcome back. Democratic Congresswoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, who went to Yale University, who was a judge, who has served in Congress since 1995 for the great state of Texas, well, she took time out from her busy schedule to educate us all on space. Here's another case of a lefty losing it galactically.
A full moon is that complete rounded circle, which is made up mostly of gases. And that's why the question is why or how could we as humans live on the moon? Are the gases such that we could do that? The sun is a mighty powerful heat that is almost impossible to go near the sun. The moon is more manageable.
The moon is made up of gases. Maybe we can live there, but the sun is near impossible for us to get to. Nearly impossible. So, maybe we can get there. Joining me now is the senior editor-at-large of Newsweek, Josh Hammer. Josh, where do I start here? The Democrats claim to be the party of science, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Most of them don't know what a woman is, and here is a veteran congresswoman who seems to know less about space than your average grade 1 student.
Rita, I saw this story earlier, and I quite literally burst out laughing. Our politics in America are so cynical and jaded these days, and there's so much terrible stuff out there. The headlines are so much more horrific than the next, that every so often a little levity is needed. And I guess I'm actually somewhat grateful for Sheila Jackson Lee for providing a little bit of levity amidst a lot of depressing news. Funny enough, I actually used to live in Sheila Jackson Lee's congressional district. So I live in Florida now, but I lived in Texas for 4 years. And about a year and a half of those 4 years was spent in Houston, which is where Sheila Jackson Lee is the congresswoman. Now, to make this even worse, and it's pretty bad at face value, but to make it even worse than it already is, Houston, Texas, as you probably know, Rita, is the home of NASA. NASA is located just outside in Houston in the suburbs. That is where the entire U.S. space industry is based. That's where you hear the people in the Apollo movie saying, Houston, we have a problem. They're talking to Houston. They're talking to Sheila Jackson Lee. And she thinks that the rock is made of gas. God help us, honestly.
Well, she almost became the mayor of Houston recently, so they dodged a bullet there perhaps, but she's still representing the state in other ways. Now, talking about Florida, a Florida mother has been sentenced to a month in prison and 3 months of home confinement for stealing and selling the diary of President Joe Biden's daughter, Ashley, to Project Veritas. Josh, incredible that with the media seems more interested in how Project Veritas got the diary than they are with the contents of this diary, which, as far as I know, have not been denied. In this diary, Ashley explores why she was, and I quote, hypersexualized at a young age, referencing being sexualized, having sex with friends at a young age. And most concerning of all, she wrote about showers with my dad, probably not appropriate. What can you tell us about this diary and the case that's just been finalised in Manhattan?
Yeah, I can't imagine why the mainstream media would try to avoid a juicy diary where you have a member of the Biden family talking about showering with the big guy himself, Joe Biden. Look, Joe Biden's been around the block. He's been a fixture of U.S. politics for roughly a half century or so. There have been so many times over the years where you see him awkwardly hugging, very awkwardly patting young girls on the head, sniffing them. I mean, I hesitate to use the word perverted, but frankly, it's hard to avoid it when you look at a lot of the clips over the years as to how this man acts when he is around women who happen to be a lot younger than he is. Apparently, it includes those who share his last name, Biden, as well. Project Veritas, which unfortunately is a shell of what it once was, the organization and James O'Keefe had a bit of a falling out, but they did tremendous work when they were in operation. James O'Keefe himself was actually pinned to the floor of his own house by the FBI back in 2021, 2022 for various other exploits, very much including the Ashley Biden journal diary saga there. So they have paid a significant price there. Ultimately, it amounts to a war on the First Amendment, a war on journalistic freedom here, and just another example, as if we needed another example of the state wielding power to punish its enemies in a deeply ideological way.
And can you imagine if this was Ivanka's diary and she had written this about Donald Trump? It would be the biggest story in the world. Everyone would be across that story. And there would be so many Americans who aren't even across this, despite the existence of this diary and Project Veritas publishing parts of it. Now, let's talk about trust in the national public radio broadcaster. That's plummeted. Our own ABC should take note of this next story. One of the stalwarts there, Yuri Berliner, who's worked at NPR for 25 years, wrote a scathing piece for the Free Press outlining how the network has lost its way and lost the trust of its audience. He writes, concerned by the lack of viewpoint diversity, I looked at voter registration for our newsroom in DC, where NPR is headquartered and many of us live. I found 87 registered Democrats working in editorial positions and 0 Republicans, none. And Josh, I've got to say, it shows, and as a taxpayer-funded media outlet, it has an obligation to be neutral, and it certainly is not, just like our ABC and SBS here in Australia.
Right. So it's the taxpayer-funded nature of NPR that has always been problematic, and this has always been the reason that many Republican politicians have sought to defund it. Hopefully this article that you're Berliner, to his great credit, went ahead and did publicly under his own name. By the way, an aside, Rita, it'll be very interesting to see how long he lasts. I mean, will he be actually out of a job next week at NPR after this whole tell-all story that he published at Barry Weiss's Free Press? That's a very interesting story in and of itself there. But, one data point that I saw in his article today that I thought was fascinating is that he goes back to as recently as 2012, which was the presidential election cycle where Mitt Romney lost to Barack Obama. In 2012, the NPR readership was only about 11% more Democrat than Republican. Then you fast forward it to the present day, it's like 55 to 60% more Democrat than Republican. So, what is going on there when it comes to the readership and the listenership? It's happened over a very short, compressed time. And I think the obvious answer, Rita, which we see playing across all of American media for the most part, other than a few stalwarts, for the most part, it's just Trump derangement syndrome. It is a post-2016, post-Trump phenomenon. NPR has been the tip of that spear, unfortunately.
It has, and it's ironic that this station that prides itself on diversity and tracks the potential job candidates there, their race, their gender, identity, all sorts of diversity and equity inclusion staff have been pushed up the ranks. And yet you look at its audience and it's overwhelmingly white, affluent, urban. They really do not actually serve the diversity of America. Only 6% of their audience is black. And when you look at the population, 14% is black. Similar with the Hispanic population, only 7% of their audience is Hispanic, when Hispanics make up around 19% of the population. So there's some really interesting takeouts there. And NPR's response has been to basically bury its head in the sand. In a letter to staff, the acting chief content officer said, "I and my colleagues on the leadership team strongly disagree with Uri's assessment of the quality of our journalism and the integrity of our newsroom processes." Yeah, okay. Whatever. Let's talk about housing affordability. This is an issue that's big in the US. It's big right here in Australia, but it's an issue that's really worsened under the Biden administration. This is something Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk explained recently.
I'm looking right now towards my future, and I'm really having a hard time really seeing myself being able to do the same things like my parents have done, such as buy a house at a young age and whatnot. Do you think there's going to be any change in the housing market?
It's a great question. So 4 years ago, the average income to be able to buy a home in this country was $59,000 a year. Now it requires $106,000 a year to buy a home. You have been robbed by the DC political class, and then big corporations like BlackRock come in and purchase these homes and then rent them back to you.
Josh, how much of an issue is this in the lead up to the presidential election? I know you've got some massive issues there, illegal immigration, the entire cost of living inflation, the crime, but surely young people being priced out of the housing market has so many long-term consequences.
Yeah, I mean, this is a massive issue, Rita, and I was happy to see that Turning Point USA was covering it. And Charlie, by the way, in his answer there is exactly right to point a big finger at BlackRock and other major institutional investors. BlackRock and other like-minded financial institutions are buying up tons and tons of residential property across America. In fact, there was actually a very interesting recent law that passed in Texas, my former state there. It was signed into law by Governor Greg Abbott that would actually limit the amount of purely residential property that large institutional investors and buyers like BlackRock can buy. And, some people might look at that and say, oh, you're impinging upon free market. They can do whatever they want. But there's something to be said for good old-fashioned common sense, frankly. And in a time like this where Gen Z and millennials are struggling more than their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation to get that first home. I'm a millennial. I'm only 35 years old. I mean, I know that acute pain very much firsthand there. It's really tough out there, and it's doubly tough given the fact that the Federal Reserve is talking about potentially actually kicking interest rates even higher as inflation continues to still be stubborn. It's very, very unfortunate right now, but I think the housing housing market, Rita, is one of the #1 issues, probably why Biden is actually hemorrhaging support among millennials and Gen Z. He's currently polling within a 10-point margin when it comes to the 18 and 35 demographic. From a Democratic Party standpoint, that's not going to cut it. He needs that number way up.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers there in successive polls would be very disturbing to the Democrats indeed. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for your time this evening. And that's it from me tonight. Don't go anywhere. Newsnight is up next. Good night.